Before I was an Episcopalian, I was a Lutheran. After seminary, but before I became a priest, I was looking for a church in my new hometown in Baltimore, Maryland, where I had just begun working at St. Paul's School. I was having a tough time finding a church home despite months of intense church shopping. And let me tell you, I am a good church shopper. After exhausting all of my Lutheran options, I decided at the recommendation of my Lutheran mentor to try the Episcopal Church. I went to the cathedral in Baltimore first, but didn't have much luck. So I decided to try a place called Memorial Episcopal Church in Bolton Hill. Now, the night before my first visit, I was at my school watching a play that a number of my students were in. A strange thought came over me while I watched that play. I love theater, I thought, and I should probably try to get back into it somehow, someday. Now, I had acted and directed and done technical theater throughout high school and college, but had done nothing since. And the thought came and went quickly without too much notice. The next morning, I went over to that church for the first time. Memorial Episcopal is over 160 years old, the church and the building. For some reason, the church has a spot on it for the steeple, but no steeple itself. I would come later to find out that they had used the steeple funds for a project in the neighborhood. The plaster inside was a total wreck. It was falling apart into our hair and onto the floor. There was no air conditioning in this church, and even some of the book racks in the pews were broken. As I sat through the service, I listened to the sermon closely, but didn't find it terribly inspiring. Sorry. And I wasn't that gripped by this new liturgy either. Even though it was just a standard Episcopal liturgy, it didn't really speak to me in that service. So when the service ended, I felt like I had another church bust on my hand. But before I could complete my thought, the people sitting in front of me turned around, smiling, with this glimmer in their eyes. "You've got a great voice," they said way too cheerfully for that early in the morning. Well, thanks, I muttered, knowing full well that my voice is not that great. "We're putting on a musical as part of the community theater that we host here at this church, and we're actually an actor short. We think you'd be perfect for the part." Oh, really? I said, wondering why in the world they thought I would be perfect for anything when they hadn't even met me yet. I agreed to learn more and to talk to someone later in the week. I extricated myself from the pew and began to head towards coffee hour, because I was a good church shopper, when two girls and a guy were there in the hallway, all of whom were around my age. They stopped me. "Are you new?" they said with that same cheerful smile and glimmer in their eyes. Yes, I hesitated, suddenly feeling quite sheepish. "Awesome," they exclaimed in unison. "We're the young adults here, and we're headed to brunch down the street. Want to come?" Sure, I stammered. I was getting roped into things left and right at this place. And yet for some reason, that was all okay. Fast forward, and Memorial Episcopal Church became my home church. They were the church that sponsored me to become a deacon and a priest. They were the church where I played the role of older Patrick in the musical Mame. And believe me, you're not missing out on anything. There's no video evidence, thank God. Memorial is where all of my non-work friends in the city came from. And it was at Memorial that I celebrated Eucharist for the first time as a priest. At the very beginning of that church shopping experience, I had a little chat with God. I prayed to God that he would connect me with a great church. And indeed, that is exactly what God did, just not in the way that I had expected. Now, this morning we're going to baptize Broderick back there in the back. And I hope Broderick is a St. Marksian for his entire life. But we're so thankful to have him and his family here this morning. So welcome to St. Mark's. And I promise I'll try to keep this as short as I can. In the gospel this morning, we have two healing stories that Mark tells back to back. In the first, Jesus casts a demon out of a woman's daughter, but only after a rather heated exchange between the woman and Jesus himself. You see, the woman is a Gentile woman, and up until this point, Jesus had only ever helped Jewish people, since Jesus himself was Jewish. When she begs him to cast out the demon from her daughter, Jesus makes kind of a weird statement. It's a little harsh about children eating first and not taking their food and throwing it to the dogs, implying kind of that she's a dog, maybe? The woman, being quick-witted and of courageous faith, fires back. Even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs, she says. Her quippy line helps Jesus see that his ministry is not just for the Jews, but for everyone, including the Gentiles. So he heals the woman's daughter. In the second healing story, we see Jesus a short time later encounter a deaf man who also has a speech impediment. Jesus takes him aside in private, puts his fingers in the deaf man's ears, spits and touches his tongue, looks to heaven, sighs, and then says, "Ephphatha," which means be opened. The man, of course, is healed and able to hear and speak once again. Now, I think that these two stories have a lot in common, and yet this morning they intrigue me for two reasons. First, I think both of these healing stories has me rethinking prayer in general, what it means to pray and how we do it. Second, I really am curious about why Jesus sighs before he says, "Ephphatha," be opened. What is that sigh all about? Now, the prayer that brings about these healings has me fascinated. Why does Jesus heal these people seemingly instantly when our prayers that we say all the time seem to go on ignored? Well, my prayer to find a new church back in the day was eventually answered. It took almost 8 months of nonstop church shopping. It took changing denominations, and it took an unexpected little church that had no steeple to finally work. Or maybe in your own lives, when we pray for our loved one who is sick, when we've been praying on our knees which are rubbed raw for healing that never seems to come. What is going on? Why doesn't God seem to answer our prayers? The woman and Jesus is kind of a strange encounter because we always think that Jesus knows exactly what he's doing at every moment of his ministry, especially the ones recorded in the Gospels. And yet in this moment, Jesus seems to be going against his words with this woman about the abundance and the table fellowship that have become his signature moves so far. Remember, he invited sinners and tax collectors to eat with them. He fed the 5,000. He shares his body and blood as food for the world. And yet here he seems to forget that this woman is also part of his charge. But his rejection is rebuffed by her clever faith. Listen again to her words. But this time, listen as though they were a prayer. "Even your discarded morsels are enough for me," she seems to say. How often in our prayers do we tell God that even the smallest morsels are enough for us? How often are our prayers about coming in second or third or even second to last rather than first? How often is our faith so great that we know that God's scraps of mercies are abundant beyond our wildest dreams? Not my prayers. My prayers have always been getting into that best school or getting the perfect job, which I have, and the best boss.
That will not get you a raise.
Or that we find that perfect church, or that we are completely cured. And yet, those prayers have never really kind of come to fruition the way I imagined they would. Memorial, for instance, was not the best fit because of the criteria that I had put on what a good church was, whether it be solid preaching, a beautiful setting, excellent music. Rather, God inspired Memorial because I needed a community. I needed a connection with the arts. I needed a nurturing home that accepted me for who I was. God saw something deeper in me that I couldn't even see in myself, and God answered that prayer. Which brings me back to that sigh of Jesus's. Why did he sigh? I have a feeling, and feel free to disagree, I have a feeling that Jesus realized that he was not being open with the Gentile woman in the previous story. That he was closed off to the possibility of his message being for the non-Jews. And he was opened to that possibility through her prayer. Her prayer was what had him realize what his ministry really was all about. He was opened in a way that perhaps he didn't expect. And then he found himself moments later in front of a man who needed the same opening. And so perhaps his sigh was ironic. Perhaps his sigh was because he knew that by opening this man who couldn't talk and couldn't hear, by opening this man, he would be exposed, as Mark talks about, that his ministry wouldn't be able to be kept a secret any longer, and it would put him on a path that inevitably leads to Jesus' death. For one, I would not have been open to Memorial if I had not gone to see that play the night before. I needed to be opened by the Spirit and caught up in the prayer that I join theater again, somehow, someday. Once that prayer flashed through my mind, I believe that God took the opportunity, not by some direct and miraculous intervention, but by God's subtle inspiration to provide a moment in my life where I could say yes. Almost as if, you want to be in theater? Okay, you're going to get your chance. Just say yes. I've said it before and I'll say it again. We pray not to change God, but for God to change us. We make the mistake to think that God is a genie in a lamp who grants us wishes, rather than prayer being a lifelong conversation with God that deepens our relationships and transforms who we are. Take a look at Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. He says two prayers in that garden. First, he says, "My Father, if it be possible, may this cup pass from me," referring to his forthcoming arrest, torture, and death. He didn't want it to happen. He didn't want to go and be crucified, and he prayed that he didn't have to go through with it. It's a perfectly legitimate prayer. And I think you and I, we're really good at those kind of petition prayers. The "cure my loved one, O Lord," or "get me that job," or "find me a spouse," or "protect me along the way." But we often forget the second prayer immediately after. We forget the prayer where Jesus says, "Yet not as I will, but as you will." The "thy will be done" prayer. It's a letting go. It's an acceptance of what is to come. It's a faith and trust that even God's morsels are more than sufficient. It's an opening of who we are to a God who was opened for our sake. That second prayer, that "thy will be done" prayer, is a much harder prayer to say. It's a prayer that requires a mature and a deep faith. It's a prayer that is a selfless faith that doesn't come about overnight. I hear Jesus' second prayer, "thy will be done," in that sigh. This is not about me. It's about opening up to God. May we join with Jesus in praying, in sighing. Ephphatha, be opened. Amen.